Are we ready to proceed with opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor. Start.
All right, at this time, ladies and gentlemen, each of the attorneys, if they wish to do so, have an opportunity to address you in that portion of the trial that I earlier referred to as the opening statement. The attorneys may not argue their case to you, but this is intended to give you that picture of what they expect the evidence will show. Mr. Davis, are you going to take for the state? Okay.
Morning. This defendant, Karen Tobie, hired this defendant, Tysjohaun Cooper, to murder her husband so she could get her husband out of her life and collect $500,000 of life insurance money. And on June the 30th of 2004, when this defendant, Karen Tobie, was inside her residence with her husband, John Cataneo, with their 1.5-year-old son, Louis, with John Cataneo's mother, Phyllis Cataneo. John Cataneo responded to a knock at the door. He answered the door, went outside, and was gunned down by Tysjohaun Cooper on his doorstep. He was shot 4 times and left dead in a pool of blood on his doorstep at 319 Center Avenue in Holly Hill. John Cataneo was 45 years old. You're going to hear about the main people involved in this case. First of all, John Cataneo. John Cataneo lived in Holly Hill at the address I just mentioned, 319 Center Avenue. It's a duplex. He owned John Cataneo Plumbing, which was not far down the road. They're in Holly Hill, had his own plumbing business. He married Karen Tobie in September of 2000, the year 2000. Their son Louis was born in December, or rather October of 2002. And they were living there at Center Avenue. In December of 2002, John Cataneo and Karen Tobie took out a life insurance policy for $500,000, and Karen Tobie was the only beneficiary for that life insurance policy. You're going to hear about how they lived. Mr. Cataneo had his plumbing business. He would work on a regular basis. Karen Tobie was not working. She drank a lot. You're going to hear testimony about the type of lifestyle that she lived. You're also going to hear about a woman and hear from a woman named Lynn Blake. Lynn Blake was a longtime friend of Karen Tobie. In fact, knew Karen Tobie even before Karen Tobie married Mr. Cataneo. Lynn Blake, at the time of Mr. Cataneo's murder, was 56 years old. Karen Tobie was 39 years old. So there's age. It was almost like an older sister or mother-daughter relationship to some extent. You're going to hear that Lynn Blake lived in the other part of the duplex. At some point years earlier, she had moved in there when Mr. Cataneo or Miss Tobie moved in with Mr. Cataneo, and then they got married. And Miss Blake began living in the other side of the duplex. Miss Blake, she's collecting Social Security for disability. She wasn't working, but she cared a lot for Louis when Mr. Cataneo was working. Karen Tobie, really, her lifestyle is she wasn't equipped as much or not desirous enough or not motivated enough really to care as much for Louis. Lynn Blake took on a large part of that responsibility. In addition to that, she was with Miss Tobie most days. In fact, Miss Tobie didn't have a driver's license, so Miss Blake would drive her around to go places. There's almost even a joke among the people that knew him as driving Miss Tobie or driving Miss Karen, because Miss Blake would drive around. Miss Tobie did not have a driver's license. So it was that type of relationship where Miss Blake was a longtime friend of Miss Tobie and became a friend of Mr. Cataneo too. But cared for Louis quite a bit, as well as helping out and driving Miss Tobie around, just a very close friend, companion. And you're going to hear about that relationship. You're going to hear that beginning in February, Valentine's Day, a little after, of 2004. Keep in mind that the murder occurred in June of 2004. Beginning around in February of 2004, the relationship between Mr. Cataneo and Ms. Tobie had been somewhat rocky, tumultuous. A lot of it based on Ms. Tobie's drinking, but things began getting rocky. Ms. Tobie was upset at not getting a gift on Valentine's Day. There was also some fear you're going to hear about in Ms. Tobie's mind about her husband taking their child. You know, he never even mentioned that. You know, I'm going to leave. I'm going to take Lewis. So there was mention of that also. And beginning in February, there were discussions. Ms. Tobie went and told Ms. Blake, "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him." And what she started doing is looking for a gun that she could get to kill her husband. And you're going to hear about that. Miss Blake will tell you she was driving her around when she was looking for a gun. And Miss Blake knew what was going on. She drove her around. She was looking for a gun. You're going to hear she actually, we're telling people, I want a gun. And it was in context of wanting to get rid of her husband, but that was why she was looking for the gun. She even said at some point, she later got a gun. I'll explain how it happened, but she was even talking about how she was going to kill her husband. You know, she was going to wait till he came home. She was dressed in disguise, and she was explaining how she was going to carry this out, telling Miss Blake that. But they were both looking for a gun, and they looked and were asking around. And finally, you're going to hear in an early April time frame, you're going to hear that people who worked for Mr. Cataneo were there working on his yard there. He was resodding his yard there. As it turns out, during that time frame, Tysjohaun Cooper was actually employed by Mr. Cataneo. He worked for him. And while they were out there, you're going to hear that Miss Tobie approached Mr. Cooper about getting a gun. I need a gun. And actually told him why. I want a gun to kill my husband. And he said, I can do it. I can get the gun for you. And you're going to hear about that conversation. You're also going to hear there were different discussions. And you're going to hear about the discussions they had about getting the gun. And you're going to hear there was actually discussion between Miss Tobie and Mr. Cooper about how much he wanted for the gun. And it was agreed on that he'd get $3,000 to get a gun. And well, that's a lot of money. You're going to understand. You're going to hear the understanding once you hear the conversation. Mr. Cooper's explaining to Miss Tobie, if you kill your husband, you're killing my boss. I won't have a job. I want to go to truck driving school, and that's going to cost about $1,800. And if you kill my boss, then I'll be out of a job. I'll need money for rent. And so Miss Tobie said, fine, I'll give you $3,000 to do it. And you're going to hear that Miss Tobie went to the bank. Miss Blake drove her there, went to the bank and made a withdrawal from the bank using 2 credit cards. You're going to hear testimony about that, see evidence of that. Used 2 credit cards to make a cash advance withdrawal for $2,700. She couldn't get $3,000. She could get $2,700, and that's what she got. You're going to hear she got made that withdrawal from the bank, and within a couple of days after that, Mr. Cooper calls, says, got the gun. They go to Volusia Mall, meet Mr. Cooper there at the mall. Mr. Cooper shows up there with his girlfriend, Samantha Alexander. They meet Miss Blake, who's driving the car, as normal. Miss Tobie was in the car, and Lewis, the young child in the back. He was usually with them all the time when they were doing a lot of these things. They meet at the mall. Mr. Cooper gets out of his car, gets in the car, gives a gun, a small caliber .22, gives the gun to Miss Tobie. Miss Blake hands him the bank envelope with $2,700 in it, gets back in the car. Mr. Cooper gets back in the car and drives off with Miss Alexander. Miss Alexander actually sees him count the money. Says it's $2,700. Saw him count the money after he had sold them the gun. You're going to hear that right after purchasing the gun from Mr. Cooper at the mall, Miss Tobie went out to test fire the gun, see if it worked. Her and Miss Blake drove way out up State Road 40, off on the way toward Ocala out there. The Ocala National Forest went out in that area, and Miss Tobie tested the gun. Lewis was with them as usual. Miss Blake was there. You're going to hear that the gun didn't work Right. Something with the clip that wasn't the clip that, you know, that goes up into, you put the bullets in an automatic and you'll hear about it. But something about the clip in the gun didn't work right. And they weren't real happy, weren't satisfied. In fact, you're going to hear that Miss Tobie joked with Miss Blake. You know, what am I going to do? How am I going to kill my husband? I'm going to go there and say, hey, hold it right here while I fix the clip so I can shoot you. You know, they're kidding, like, this isn't going to work. We can't do it this way. You're going to hear about the discussion after getting the gun. And this is getting in, if you recall, around early April, so is when the conversation is, when Mr. Cooper said he'd get the gun. You're going to hear that actually the withdrawal of $2,700 was in around May 14th, and the Volusia Mall incident was in the mid-May time frame. So this is just to get you moving up toward June the 30th. So after the gun doesn't work, Miss Tobie decides, well, forget it. I need to get someone to do this for me. I need to get someone to do it for me. And she tells this to Miss Blake. And at that point, you're going to hear that Miss Tobie approached Tysjohaun Cooper at the shop there, at the plumbing shop, and he agreed to actually kill Mr. Cataneo. And you're going to hear discussions that were had. And Miss Blake was present, saw, he kind of made a hand gesture, I'm your man, I can take care of it. And then there were some discussions even after that between them. As it turned out, she said she'd give him $5,000 out of the insurance money that she would be expecting to get from this. And you're going to hear this is over a discussion period of time. This wasn't one discussion. There were numerous discussions. You're going to hear that after Mr. Cooper agreed to kill Mr. Cataneo, Miss Tobie and Miss Blake would drive by the shop quite a bit. Hey, what's going on? You know, when's it going to happen? And that's important because they made it clear to Mr. Cooper, and in their minds, there was a deadline approaching that they had to kill Mr. Cataneo by. And that deadline was something that had been in the works for a few months, and that's a family reunion, which was happening the 4th of July weekend up in Georgia. The Cataneo family was all getting together. The Cataneos were coming from New York. Cattaneos were here locally. We're going to go up there. We're going to make a big reunion. In fact, you're going to hear that Phyllis Cataneo, the mother of John, actually had been staying at the house there in Holly Hill. As you heard me said earlier, she was actually there the night that her son was murdered. But she had been staying there off and on, and there were other sisters of Mr. Cataneo locally. But the long and short is everyone was going to meet up in Georgia. And there was fear on the part of Miss Tobie and Miss Blake that Mr. Cataneo was going to take Lewis, the son, up there, and something, he wouldn't come back. Like, he'd keep going to New York or get the son. There was a big fear of theirs that he would be gone, and that was, you know, whether it was real or not. But that was their discussion. Well, we have to do it by this date because that might happen. So you're going to hear that any discussions that I'm talking about, the reason I'm explaining that is because they made that clear to Mr. Cooper. It's got to be done before July 1st because they're going to be leaving soon after that to go up to Georgia for this reunion. So that was a deadline. It was impressed upon Mr. Cooper. It's got to get done. They go by the shop when they have contact with him. There were actually conversations where Ms. Tobie would say, it's got to get done. Ms. Blake would pipe in, yeah, the sooner the better. It's got to get done soon. And you're going to hear about those conversations. And Mr. Cooper, fine, no problem. I'll get it done. You're also going to hear of a conversation even at Mr. Cataneo's house when he wasn't there, but Mr. Cooper's unloading another conversation along the same lines with Ms. Tobie there, with Ms. Blake there. Mr. Cooper even said, well, I'm going to do it the 4th of July weekend because there will be a lot of noise and you won't hear the gunshots and pops as much. And Ms. Tobie made it clear, no, that's too late. It can't be on the 4th. It's got to be done before. It's got to be done by July 1st. So that's impressed upon Mr. Cooper with Ms. Tobie present, Ms. Blake present, and also the price, as I talked about, the $5,000. And keep in mind, you're going to hear testimony from Ms. Blake that statements were made by Ms. Tobie to her indicating there had been even other conversations or meetings that she wasn't privy to, but you'll hear the ones that she was privy to, not only with Ms. Tobie, but with Mr. Cooper also. You're going to hear about discussions that Ms. Blake and Ms. Tobie had with each other. Basically about what they were going to do after Mr. Cataneo was killed. You're going to hear discussions they had, well, we're going to have that. Even Ms. Blake was telling Ms. Tobie, look, $500,000 sounds like a lot, but it's not, you know, it's not to raise a child and do things. It's not going to go as far as you think. They talked about buying a new house. They were going to, I believe together, Lynn Blake would take care of the child. She was very attached to Lewis, by the way, and she cared for Lewis. They even talked about Karen Tobie was worried that Mr. Cataneo would find a house. He was actually looking for another house to move into, looking around, was worried, and indicated to Miss Blake that, well, I hope he doesn't find a house or get a house before he's killed, because then we'll be saddled with that debt, or I'll be saddled with that debt. So there were these discussions among them about life after the murder of Mr. Cataneo. And they impressed on him the deadline, but you'll hear that it's not as if it was a set time and date. It's not as if they wanted to hear, look, you do it, you're going to get the money from the insurance, take care of it. He said he'd do it. He knew when the deadline was. But they didn't know exactly what day it was going to happen. But you can hear discussions that they had even among themselves. They'd be there at the duplex there. Well, I wonder if it's going to be tonight. I wonder if it's going to be tonight. They didn't know. But he had said he was going to do it, was going to take care of it. And then finally, and keep in mind, while all this is going on, and you heard the living arrangements, but while this is going on, Karen Tobie is living with, sharing a bedroom, sharing a bed with John Cataneo. During the entire time when she's getting the gun, looking for the gun, got the gun, test fired the gun, hired Mr. Cataneo to do it, all this going on, she's living there, sleeping with John Cataneo. John Cataneo's mother goes in there and stays there with their young child. So that's what's going on during this time frame. And finally, on June the 30th, in the evening hours around 9:30 or so, Mr. Cooper came through for Miss Tobie. And you're going to hear about that evening. And I told you who was present in the one part of the duplex where Mr. Cataneo lived with Miss Tobie. Mr. Cataneo's mother was there, and the child. And you're going to hear that Lynn Blake was in her residence, the other part of the duplex. She was watching TV next door. There was a knock on the door. At that time, Mrs. Cataneo, John's mother, was in the living room area with Mr. Cataneo. John Cataneo was there in the easy chair, just kind of dozing off in the chair. Miss Tobie's in the back room, presumably sleeping back there. Lewis has been put down. He's in the back. There's a knock on the door, and Miss Cataneo, the mother, goes to the door and asks who it is, and she hears someone. She does not sure what's said. She thinks it's something like Don, Ron, something like that. Asks again, doesn't quite catch what it is, but there's some name like Don, Ron, or something. She goes and wakes up John Cataneo. He says, I'll take care of it. I'll go see who's there. He walks to the door. Mrs. Cataneo goes in to get some coffee in the kitchen area. John Cataneo actually opens the door, steps outside the door, and closes the door behind him. And right after that, there are these pop, 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 several pops. At first, the inside they weren't even sure what it was, firecrackers, what's going on. There are numerous pops. And it was soon discovered that, inside, after hearing that sound, there was a call next door to Miss Blake. Is John over there? He went out. He's not back. Miss Blake went out, saw Mr. Cataneo lying there on the doorstep. He was lying, and you'll see the photo. He's lying there, so he couldn't even open the door. He fell right at the door, on the doorstep. His mother tried to open the door to see what's going on and couldn't, because he was lying. It was lying there, dead. Blocking the front door there. And again, you'll see pictures describing that. 911, Miss Blake went out, saw him, she ran back and called 911. They all gathered together there inside the residence. Mr. Cataneo was shot 4 times. He was shot in the left eye, he was shot in the left cheek, he was shot in the neck, he was shot in the chest. And you'll see that the way the bullets went, as if someone's falling or even on the ground, 3 of those bullets, the one in the cheek went in and out, but the other 3 bullets actually ended up in his brain. He pretty much died instantly from the gunshots and dropped right there and died right there. You're going to hear about the crime scene and see what was found, and again, see photographs of that. 3 shell casings were found at the scene. And you're going to hear, most of you know this, I know, but shell casings you're going to hear are actually when in an automatic pistol, when the pistol fires, the shell casing, or the metal portion, that actual jacket that holds the bullet in, is ejected. So that when you shoot, bullet goes out, shell casing goes out. 3 shell casings were found there. You heard there was 4 shots, so 1 wasn't found, but 3 shell casings were found. A bullet fragment was actually found in the blood by Mr. Cataneo's head. You're going to hear at autopsy, 3 bullets or fragments were recovered. You're going to hear testimony that the bullets were fired. They'll fragment when they hit things or get inside the body. But the 1 bullet, if you recall, I said went through. 3 bullets or fragments of bullets were found at autopsy in Mr. Cataneo. And again, 3 shell casings were found there at the scene. And you're going to hear testimony about that and what was done with that. Obviously, needless to say, I think we know in this day and age, those items are all going to be submitted into evidence and sent to the laboratory, which was done in this case, for testing and comparison if something later turns up, as in this case it did, which you'll hear about. After the murder, and obviously you're going to hear about the police showed up and they interviewed the people there, the family, and took them down, and you're going to hear about that. But after the homicide, this isn't something where an arrest was made the next day, things were put together the next day. This went on there a period of a month or 2, putting things together, interviewing people, and you're going to hear about that investigation and things that unfolded, important things that, important leads that the police discovered. You're going to hear, first of all, and the police will frankly say, and the witnesses, that Ms. Tobie was a suspect, pretty much from the get-go, right, and for various reasons. One being, the night of the murder, she really didn't seem to be interested in talking to anybody. Actually told the police when they said, we'd like to come down and talk to you about what happened. Can this wait? Can this wait? Do I have to do it now? There was that kind of attitude that evening. It was soon learned that about the life insurance policy that she had, the $500,000. She actually, within a week, was down there trying to collect her money and made repeated calls to the insurance company. Where is my money? When am I getting my money? Things like that obviously raised red flags to the investigators. Mr. Cataneo's son, Chuck, the behavior that he had toward her that evening, very upset. Keep her away from me. Keep her away from me. So you're going to hear from the son, Mr. Cataneo, about things that happened. Matter of fact, one of them was that Ms. Tobie actually gone to Chuck, the son of Mr. Cataneo, at some point earlier, and actually said, "Why don't you just take care of your dad? Why don't you take care of him? We'll run the business, and all this stuff." And he was shocked by it. Didn't take her seriously, but just was shocked. But obviously later, after what happened, things are in his mind. So anyway, his behavior, you're going to hear the police, that also raised red flags. And you're going to hear that Miss Blake and Miss Tobie went up to Seattle, Washington, not long after the homicide. Again, as you remember, I said she tried to collect her money, went down a week or so later. The insurance tried to get that. They said, obviously, it's going to be on hold for a while the investigation is completed. She went up to Seattle because she had family up there. And it was something she let the police know, and she's going up to Seattle. And you're going to hear just conversations that she had with the police. And the police actually went up to Seattle, thought, well, we'll go talk to her up there. She's going to be there for a while. She stayed up there for a month or so with Miss Blake. And again, she had family up there. But you're going to hear one conversation. I'm going through things that early on kind of raise signals with the police or kind of raise your eyebrows. You're going to hear a conversation. Investigator McGuire went up there, one of the homicide investigators, and basically flat out told her, we think you had something to do with this. We think you might have hired someone to do this. And her response to him was just looked at him and just said, well, prove it, and walked away. So those type of things obviously raise suspicions with the police. And so this investigation was going on, talking to employees. Mr. Cooper was an employee, as I said, talking to other employees, family members, witnesses, doing all of that. Then you're going to hear that break came in early August 10th. There was an incident in Ormond Beach involving Samantha Alexander. Remember, Samantha Alexander is the one I said was with Mr. Cooper at the mall when he sold the gun to Ms. Tobie. But Samantha Alexander was the girlfriend of Mr. Cooper. there was a domestic situation at Ormond. The police responded. Actually, it was at Mr. Cooper's house where he lived there with his parents. He wanted to kick Miss Alexander out. They were getting a fight. I want her out of here. The police showed up, and Miss Alexander's yelling stuff there. Well, you're going to jail for killing your boss man. You killed that Holly Hill. You're going to go. She's making statements like that. So obviously the police were there. They didn't. It wasn't their jurisdiction, but they ended up calling Holly Hill Police Department and said, "You might want to talk to Miss Alexander. She's yelling out this stuff to Mr. Cooper." And that's what they did. Miss Alexander came in, and you're going to hear from her. What Miss Alexander's going to tell you is, one is she was there at the mall. She doesn't know that a gun was sold, she says, but she knows he got out of the car that he was driving, got into another car right there, got back in the car, had $2,700 bank envelope, counted the money when they went down. She was there, she was present for that. You're also going to hear from her that once you've seen him with a firearm before, and she's going to explain to you that after Mr. Cooper's boss, and that's what she's going to refer to, she knew his boss man was killed, his boss was killed, we all know being Mr. Cataneo, that his behavior was very odd, and she'll explain that to you. Such as grabbing a newspaper from about the article, let me see that. She overheard a suspicious phone call, mentioning things that just raised her suspicions, his behavior. And keep in mind, one thing I didn't say earlier, but Mr. Cooper stopped working a week or so before the murder happened. He was working in Cataneo Plumbing, then he stopped working and never went back. And then after the murder, the behavior, and she'll explain it to you. There were suspicions. She'll even tell you she actually confronted him about it. Like, hey, you had something to do with that, didn't you? Were you involved, or what you had to do with it? And his reaction was he got violent toward her. Basically, keep your mouth shut, and pushed her down. Never denied it. She'll tell you she asked him more than one. Never denied it. Just would get angry when she mentioned it or tried to ask him questions about it. And she'll explain to you that. So when she talked to the police about that got them looking more at Mr. Cooper, and knowing that he had worked there, and also knowing that there were some contacts. And the police had talked to some family members just a few days before the murder. Some family members of Mr. Cataneo, the mother and sister, had gone to his house there, and Mr. Cooper was there by himself with Miss Tobie there by herself at the house. At the time, they thought, that's pretty strange, and what's going on here, and what was said didn't really add up. But obviously, that's a few days before the murder. But afterwards, the suspicions were raised at that point. So these things are coming together. Miss Alexander comes in and gives a statement, and she'll explain to you what she saw and heard. That led to another woman. The police checked phone records of Mr. Cooper and found, there are a lot of phone calls between him and this one phone. And they went and tracked down that phone, found out who had that phone, and that phone was owned by, actually being used by Larissa Whipper, another woman who you'll hear from. Larissa Whipper actually knew Mr. Cooper from Wendy's. Mr. Cooper worked at Wendy's on the weekends, and she knew him from Wendy's, and they developed a friendship. They talked a lot on the phone. She'll say it wasn't really dating. Later she found out she was some distant cousin, or they were related in some manner, but she'll explain that to you. But Miss Whipper also will tell you about her dealings with Mr. Cooper before and after the homicide. And again, she'll talk about the same. She had her suspicions after the homicide based on his behavior. And again, she confronted him. She said, look, did you have something to do with that because of things that the way he was acting? And again, same things, that he reacted violently toward her, cussed at her, threatened her, said you better not say or do anything, and had that reaction when confronted. Also, she told the police, and she'll explain to you, back in mid-June or so, she remembers talking to him on the phone. And that's best, she doesn't know exact day, but it was in the mid-June time frame. She's talking on the phone to Mr. Cooper, and she hears a pow, a pop. And she says, what's that? And Mr. Cooper on the phone says to her, I'm just firing my gun here out in my backyard. I'm just test firing my gun in my backyard. And she didn't do anything, didn't say anything. She knew him to have a gun. She'd seen him with a gun before. He had made a statement to her or something. I'm going to put my gun up. And then she had this conversation about this bang, and he's saying I'm in the backyard, firing my gun. She doesn't do anything. She doesn't say anything. And remember me saying, she didn't even come forward to the police even later. The police actually tracked her down, and she came in and talked to them. Well, putting everything together, if you remember, the police have the 3 shell casings from the murder scene. The police did a search warrant, had a search warrant signed by a judge to go to the backyard of Mr. Cooper's residence there in Ormond Beach. And lo and behold, after searching around in the backyard, they found a shell casing in some thick grass. You see, but they found a shell casing in the backyard, and in a flower pot several feet away, I think 11 or so feet away, in a flower pot, a little hole. It was a bullet hole in a flower pot in his backyard with a bullet actually inside the flower pot. So they recovered that bullet. They recovered the shell casing that was there several feet away. They submitted that shell casing to the lab to compare with the 3 shell casings found at the murder scene where Mr. Cataneo was murdered in Holly Hill. Now keep in mind, before that was submitted, the ballistics specialist at Florida Department of Law Enforcement, you'll hear from him, Greg Scala, he'd already examined the 3 casings and made the determination to explain how he does. It's a microscopic testing. You're looking for certain marks. He'll explain that all casings that are ejected have certain marks that are unique to that particular gun, and you can compare microscopically identifiers. Because of the gun, the wear and tear, the makes of gun, you're going to get different marks on casings. And if you have enough identifiers or enough marks, you can say that these are fired from the same gun. He had already determined that those 3 shell casings at the scene had all been fired from the same gun. And he'll say, well, and obviously the police will say that's not telling them much, because when you hear pop, 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 and you hear pops and you find shell casings there. But he had already examined them and made that determination. But when he got the shell casing from the Ormond Beach home of Mr. Cooper, he compared that microscopically to one of the shell casings, one of the 3, and it was a match. And he'll tell you, based on that examination report, he'll explain it and explain the science behind it, that shell casing at Mr. Cooper's in his backyard, in the backyard that he told Larissa Whipper is back there firing his gun, that shell casing was a match of the shell casing found at the murder scene. And you're going to hear about discussions that he had with the police when, even before the match, when they went out and told him about the search warrant, and statements that he made to the police. One of them, toward the end, he made the statement, this is before they knew, the police were there saying, we served the search warrant in your backyard. They were talking to him saying that we're sending it to the lab. Mr. Cooper's very, very interested in the process and how does that work and how do they examine it. And he says, well, it won't match, and it won't match. But if it does match, and then he called himself and stopped and didn't say anything else. But you'll hear the police about that conversation. But the long and short of it is, it was a match, the shell casings. You're also going to hear after that, the investigation even continued after that, and there were people found that Miss Tobie was out there running her mouth to. You're going to hear about this is 04, the hurricanes went through. We had Charlie, Francis, and a period of hurricanes, and the power was lost. This is after the homicide, so Miss Tobie and Miss Blake went and stayed in a motel beachside that had power. You're going to hear that Miss Tobie was running her mouth off about what she'd done. You're going to hear from a woman she befriended over there who flat out just said, I hired a guy to kill my husband. I know I'm going to prison. You think I'm going to get the death penalty? You think I think that's going to happen? I'm having sex with as many people as I can now because I know I'm going to go away for a long time. You know, that's you're going to hear about that. That's what she was doing, running her mouth off.
Excuse me, Your Honor. I have a motion to make at the bench.
All right. Yes, sir.
Anyway, Miss Tobie was talking to people, running her mouth. If you hear from one of those people at the motel with regard to what she said. So the police were putting things together around this, and we're getting into late September, early October. You're going to hear what happened then is the police just from talking to people, knew that there were some problems developing between Miss Blake and Miss Tobie. You know, Miss Blake was kind of doing, or Miss Tobie was doing her thing. Miss Blake was trying to, care for Lewis at certain parts of the time. And anyway, there was some friction developing there. They weren't spending as much time together. Miss Tobie was spending time with some other people. So the police will tell you, they exploited that. I mean, they brought Miss Blake in and basically said to her, explained to her, hey, you were close to, solving this thing. We know Miss Tobie's involved. We know she hired somebody. We know you're involved, and just went into that and basically said to her, look, you talk now, you cooperate now, and things will probably be better for you. They can't make any promises. They can't do anything, but they exploited that friction that was developed. Because keep in mind, I didn't mention this earlier, but remember the trip to Seattle? Miss Blake actually made the comment, and you're going to hear from her that was very close to Miss Tobie. I mean, it was, as I said, almost like a younger sister-daughter type relationship, and she wasn't inclined to give her up, so to speak. But this friction began developing, and the police came in and said, look, time's coming now. We're close to solving this. You better talk. And they actually talked to her about things that Miss Tobie was doing, and that upset Miss Blake. She's out running around doing things. Miss Blake knew that, but they were taking advantage of that friction there. And basically, I tell you, they tried to drive a wedge between that relationship, and hopefully one would break or give it up before the other. And as it turns out, Miss Blake would explain certain things that really upset her. Even the fact that, and this is something that the police will tell you, they kind of stumbled onto. Do you remember I talked about Miss Tobie didn't have a driver's license? Well, the police actually found a Florida identification card. It has on there, safe driver. They thought that was a driver's license, be it as it may, whether it was or wasn't, doesn't really matter. But they were telling Miss Blake that, well, she's got a driver's license, so she's basically been using it all this time by having you drive around, and actually she could be driving. Well, that unbeknownst to police, and it wasn't true, but that Miss Blake will tell you, it really upset her. She went back and confronted Miss Tobie after the interview with the police. Hey, what's this about you having a license? You're just using me. And there was talk about how Miss Tobie was going to try to pin all this on Miss Blake. So all this is going on, and the police bring Miss Blake in and explain all this to her. And as she's leaving, she's not saying, I don't know anything, but they're telling her all these things. And as she's leaving, the police say, we were hoping you were going to come in and tell us the truth. We were really hoping that you were going to tell us the truth and tell us what happened, what you know. And one other police said, but you're not going to do that, are you? She shook her head and said no. She just shook her head no, she wasn't. And she left. So the police knew then or suspected she was close based on behavior. And sure enough, the next day, Miss Blake calls and says, I want to come down, come pick me up. I want to come down and talk to you. And she did. And she came down to the police and explained to them a lot of what I've been telling you, and explained to them what had happened and about the conversations all the way back to trying to get Miss Tobie and her trying to get a gun, about going to Volusia Mall, about making the withdrawal, buying the gun, testing the gun. She went through all that, and about Mr. Cooper agreed to do it. But Ms. Blake explained all of that. She even, you'll hear the next day, the police, they didn't arrest her right then, because she incriminated herself also. They didn't arrest her right then. She even agreed to wear the next day, she wore a microphone hidden inside her shirt or bra inside here. And all the police said to her was just go and tell Miss Tobie that you have to be at the Holly Hill Police Department at 4 o'clock today and just see the reaction. So the police actually went there and talked to Miss Tobie over here, kind of distracted her, and then other police went over and put the microphone on Miss Blake and her side of the duplex and told her to say that. And you'll hear that. I mean, she came back and said, I have to be there at 4 o'clock, and there's some discussion because Miss Tobie's on the phone, but during that conversation, she's telling her, don't tell him anything, don't say anything, just play dumb like that, don't say anything, you don't have to go, anyway, you'll hear all that. So she's making his statements on her, just in response to, I have to go to the police department. So you'll hear about that, and also you're going to hear that when they were arrested, which will be the following day, Miss Tobie and Miss Blake were arrested. They were taken to Holly Hill Police Department, and in the same patrol car. They were taken there and put in the same patrol car there, and nobody told anybody they were being recorded at all, and you're going to hear the recorded conversation between them in the back of the car. Even there is talk at some point between them about, well, this is probably being recorded, but they still make statements. There's statements in the recording. You know, first of all, you're not going to hear anything in the recording about why are we here, or we didn't do this. You just hear Ms. Tobie say, oh, well, they got the big murderers, I guess, and you know, how's my hair look, and there's cameras here, and you know, I should have gotten that passport and got out of the country. But you're going to hear statements, and there's conversations between both of them in the back of that patrol car, and you'll hear that. So this is an outline of the evidence, and you're going to hear from Ms. Blake. Ms. Blake's going to come here and testify. She's a co-conspirator. She's an accomplice. Ms. Blake was indicted with the same charges as Ms. Tobie, first-degree murder. And keep in mind, just while I'm going through the charges, with first-degree murder, you're going to see that there's a charge of first-degree murder, and you'll hear the law instructed later, but first-degree murder can be either committing the murder, as Mr. Cooper did, or being a principal.
Objection to improper opening.
Sustained.
Or being a principal, and you're going to hear principal instruction about aiding and abetting someone in commission of murder. So that's part of the law that we'll get into later. But Ms. Tobie and Ms. Blake were actually charged and indicted on the same charges. That would be principal of first-degree murder.
Objection to improper opening. The court has informed the jury what they're charged with.
You may reference the indictment counts only, but not go any further into the law, because this isn't the appropriate time.
I'm fine on that.
Okay.
I'm getting this so I can get to Ms. Blake. That's my purpose. Okay. Ms. Tobie and Ms. Blake were both charged with principal of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and then solicitation to commit first-degree murder. Ms. Blake, as you heard, came and talked to the police, cooperated, wore a wire. She's going to be testifying. She has entered a plea. She was allowed to enter a plea to, instead of first-degree murder, to second-degree murder. So she's entered a plea, second-degree murder, and also to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and solicitation to commit first-degree murder. And you'll hear from her that because of that, she's facing life in prison, but it's not mandatory. It's up to the judge at the time of her sentencing, after her testimony, after these cases are complete, she will go before the judge to be sentenced. And she's facing up to life in prison, and it's going to be up to the judge whether she gets that or gets something short of that. But that's what's happened with Ms. Blake, and she'll inform you of that. And she'll flat out tell you, yes, I'm hoping I get a benefit, but I don't know that. You know, she'll tell you testify that said at the time this happened, she was 56 years old. It's been a couple years, so you know, she's not sure what's going to happen to her, but that's what benefit she received with regard to her cooperation, and she'll explain that to you. So you're going to hear from actually a participant in this, and then you're going to hear other evidence, and it's obviously up to you to decide the corroboration, if there is corroboration, and we certainly feel there is, to the evidence by Ms. Blake, as well as the other circumstances, that being statements from both defendants and their actions, and the evidence that was found that relates to both of them. And as you know, in this case, Ms. Tobie is charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and solicitation to commit first-degree murder. And Mr. Cooper is charged with the first two.
Your Honor, improper opening. You've instructed the jury what they're charged with.
I'm wrapping up here.
Please do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just making sure you understand. Mr. Cooper is charged with the first two. Obviously charged with solicitation related to the other two. Mr. Cooper is charged with the murder, committing the murder, and conspiracy to commit the murder. And after hearing all the evidence, we'll be asking you and confident that the evidence shows that each of these defendants, Karen Tobie and Tysjohaun Cooper, are guilty as they've been indicted. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, excuse me, we're going to take our mid-morning break. I'm going to ask you to come back at 10 after 11. That's about a 15-minute break. You are not. You've heard one opening statement here. You haven't even heard the rest of the opening statements. And be that as it may, you may not make your determination here until you've heard not only the statements, but the evidence, the closing statements, and the discussions on the law, and release for deliberation. So you may not discuss this case with anyone. You're released until 10 after 11.
Judge, it's titled Order Granted in Part and Denying in Part Defendant's Motion in Limine served October 4th.
Okay, I have it before me.
I'd ask you to focus on paragraph 3, sir. I'd like to read into the record if I
Yes,
could.
please do.
As the defendant's motion in limine contained in paragraph 3C, testimony relating to alleged sexual activity of the defendant after the death of her husband, it is granted in part. The state may not make specific reference to the said alleged incidents unless they become a genuine part of other circumstances in the evidence which would make such incidents relevant to a material fact in the trial. We haven't had any evidence, Judge, and there was a specific reference by the state, and this was the exact reason that we filed this motion in limine, because we were fearful that the state would try to make a moral judgment on our client's behalf post-death, totally irrelevant to the charges in the case, a feature of their case. You said they couldn't do it, and he did it on opening statement, and for that reason, I would move from this trial. I don't see if there's any other cure available, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, Judge, if I recall the discussion now, the defense was concerned about us presenting evidence that she was having sex with all these people. In fact, there is evidence about her, you know, we did deposition about her having sex with 2 guys in the pool there at the motel, doing all these things. And that's what part of the defensive motion was directed at. I agreed, and I don't intend to have any evidence presented with regard to anything like that going on. What I was explaining even at the motion to the judge is the context of her, I think I'm going to prison, that's why I'm doing certain things. It's explaining the context of her, like, I'm having sex with these guys because I expect you're going to prison. It's the context of the statement, without our intent at all to offer any evidence. I mean, she may or may not have been doing that at all. We're not going to present evidence of that, but we're showing the context of her statement. And you know, in my mind, again, with regard to the statement, Your Honor, I frankly wasn't thinking one way or the other. It's not that I said I'm going to say this and I think this is proper. I was going through statements that the defendant made in my opening statement. And if, first of all, if the order is violated, it wasn't with relation. I didn't say she's having sex with people. We're going to show evidence of that. It's simply the context of her statement. Secondly, Your Honor, we strongly feel it is relevant. It should come in to explain the context of her statement. Again, without evidence, she happens like she's just spouting off, I wonder if I'm going to get death penalty. Well, I want to have sex with many guys because I'm going to go in prison for a long time. I mean, it shows the nature and context of her statement. So, you know, one is in terms of violation of the court order. I'm not, you know, I didn't get into any evidence we're going to show of that. It's not a feature. It was a small phrase, and I don't know how long the opening statement was. And again, I think it is evidence that will be relevant.
Judge, I'd like to respond, and I remember now specifically, and it's not in the written order, but if we can pull up that hearing that day, I went as far as said, can you please make sure they do not mention it on opening? And you said, Mr. Davis, you cannot mention it on opening. It's getting worse as I'm standing here remembering it. And I'm sorry that it's happened. And the last thing we all want to do is repick a jury. But this is a very important part of our case that we had a pretrial hearing on. We were all put on notice of what your ruling was. And sometimes it's harder to do the right thing, but we may have to do that here, Judge. I don't see how it can be cured. If you bring it up, it's just going to come out again. She said she'll have sex with every man alive till she goes to prison. It's evidence. I mean, that's what you said he can't do.
Well, first of all, that wasn't the statement. But secondly, even if, and again, I'm trying to remember too, and I'm assuming that your order was violated. In fact, assuming at a hearing that I said, look, it's only a statement. I don't present to get into evidence of it, but here's a statement made. Here's the context. I feel it's relevant. If Your Honor said, don't get into an opening, I agree, which could have happened. I just don't recall, Your Honor. I'm not disputing Mr. Nielsen. But I'm saying, first of all, you need to look at the prejudice. I mean, if it's relevant evidence that is going to be coming in, even if I violated, again, it was unintentional, but if I unintentionally violated the court order, the question would be the prejudice that is suffered. And again, we're not talking about introducing evidence that happened. We're talking about the context of an admission being made by the defendant, which I even argued that the motion that I felt it was strongly relevant should come in. But in fairness, Your Honor, I may have said, again, I'm trying to remember too, I don't have notes, but I may have said, well, we won't get into it until it comes up. I very well may have done that. But again, I don't think the level of rise to a prejudice that makes it such that it taints the trial.
Okay. Yes, one more.
Sorry, but if I just said one thing. By Mr. Davis laying out the reason for it, he's saying it's to show an admission. I can't think of anything more prejudicial than an admission. This is what we're talking about. He's trying to put it in context of an admission. There's nothing more prejudicial than an admission against a criminal defendant. It's not a harmless error.
Well, okay, thank you. As we all know, evidence that tends to be relevant it makes material facts more or less likely. That's the definition of their being relevant. It necessarily can help one side or hurt one side. That's not the question as far as prejudice is concerned. The question is it unfair prejudice, and is it prejudice that should not occur, and is it prejudice to the extent that a fair trial is not granted to one side or the other. In the order itself, there is no ruling as to using it in opening statement. It is, the order says that it's granted in part only. It doesn't say it's granted, it says it's granted in part. The state may not make specific reference to the said alleged incidents unless they become a genuine part of other circumstances in the evidence, which would make such evidence and incidents relevant to a material fact. And by that, I intended to say that that kind of evidence could only be, an opening statement is in the context of the evidence, could only be within a relevant context. And it seems to me that it was. This is part of conduct after the trial, not for the purpose of judging somebody morally or not for the purpose of trying to prejudice them in an unfair fashion, but rather consistent with conduct which, if there's evidence of it put in, and if it's believed by the jury, could be relevant to a material issue. With that said, I'm going to deny the motion for mistrial.
Your Honor, respecting your ruling, would it make a difference to the court if, in fact, you did pronounce at the day of the hearing that it was not allowed to be mentioned in an opening statement?
Frankly, I recall something to that effect. I do recall something to that effect. I'd have to see a transcript of it. But again, if we were talking about that it wouldn't be tied up or wouldn't be presented until evidence is presented, then we'll get into the question of, I'll reconsider it on that basis, and we would get into the question of actual prejudice.
Yes, sir.
Let's go and take our break until.
So just one housekeeping measure. Mr.
Yes, sir.
Mott and I discussed the order of what we would go. Mr. Mott's requested to go first.
Okay.
We don't have any objections.
All right, fine. I'll note that.
Thank you.
Judge, one other thing. We talked about the lunch break at all?
Probably 12. Well, do you need some extra time today? This first
No,
time?
I'm talking about every day. I was wondering if we could have an hour and 15 minutes.
Okay.
We found that we get somewhere and order it, and then we cram it down and shut back.
That's not unreasonable. We have jurors that are